thank you to everybody who's watching us. We can't see you, but at least I hope you can see all of us. I'm Jeff Thale. I'm WOLA's president, and I've been at WOLA for a number of years and worked in a number of different areas, and I'm proud to be helping lead the team here in the work we do. This panel is the first in a series. The series is called Taking Stock of the Trump Administration, Human Rights and Democratic Governance in Latin America. And I think from our point of view, it's important to do this series and all of its 4 pieces. We're going to do a piece every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the next 4 weeks. Because there's been a lot of discussion about U.S. foreign policy in particular issues. So Venezuela, Brazil, trade with Mexico and tariffs. But I think for us, it's important to step back and look at the impact of the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy approach to Latin America and the impact of that approach on human rights and democracy and democratic governance across the board. And that's why in this and each of the panels, we're going to have a series of speakers from Brazil through Central Mexico and Central America, and kind of trying to look at the range of issues in the hemisphere as a whole. So thank you all for joining us. This week, we'll be talking about rising authoritarianism in the region. Next week's panel will take a look at challenges in terms of corruption and rule of law issues. The third panel looks at civic space and democratic norms in the region, and the fourth on migration and human mobility. All of those are topics of real challenges facing Latin America and the Caribbean. They're topics, obviously, and challenges that preceded the Trump administration and are generated by issues in the region itself. But they're challenges, all of them are challenges that are influenced or can be influenced one way or another by the policy or actively or by omission of the United States. So this series wants to look at the impact of U.S. foreign policy and the Trump administration's approach on all of those areas. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the United States is not exactly at a moment when it is a beacon for the world on many of these issues. We're facing unrest here over police abuse and racial injustice. Some people have probably seen in the last few days that the White House and the administration have deployed Homeland Security officers in what are essentially domestic law enforcement activities. Right now, most recently, there's this really chilling example in Portland, Oregon of what turned out to be DHS officials, DHS agents, without markings to identify them, carrying a protester, detaining somebody and carrying them off into an unmarked vehicle. So though in the end, things turned out okay in that particular case, it's kind of a chilling reminder of things we saw in Argentina and in Central America, in decades past. So we're not at a moment when the U.S. is a beacon for the world on these issues, and we need to acknowledge that. At the same time, the values of democratic governance, the values of human rights are ones, in our view, certainly, that we need to work on here at home and that we need to support internationally. And so we think, given all that, it's important time to do this panel. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Jimena Sanchez, who directs our program on Colombia and the Andes, who's worked on Brazil and a range of migration issues in the hemisphere over many years, to introduce our panelists. The only last thing I want to say is I'm really proud of the diverse panel we have and of the range of participants. We have old friends of WOLA, we have diplomats, we have academics and activists, we have people from the United States and from the region. We have a number of journalists. And so just to say finally, welcome to everybody. And this is an on-the-record conversation. And let me turn it over to you, Jimena.
Hi, so good morning to the panelists. Good morning, Jeff, and to all of the people who are participating. I'm very excited to be moderating the first of this really important series. Those of us who are living in DC woke up today actually to NPR's interview with Annie Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize historian journalist, who just released the latest book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, which notes that Trump's influence is a global threat. The penchant for the strongman figure during moments of crisis, like the one we are living in today with the global pandemic and other issues, has historically exposed the fragile nature of liberal democracies, strained the rule of law, squeezed human rights, and created obstacles for free elections. Autocratic tendencies in tumultuous times are not new. And globally, we see that such leaders often feed off of each other, forming alliances and emboldening each other's most controversial actions. Perhaps what might be newer in this day and age is that these situations can happen much faster due to technology and our interconnected world, and how easy it is to provide false or manipulated information and for that to spread. However, that said, often these leaders are really a product of broader issues facing a society. So to understand how this phenomenon is taking hold in Latin America and how Trump's actions may be emboldening such leaders, we have invited 3 different experts to engage with us today about the subject. These are Camila Asano, the program director from Conectas Direitos Humanos, Brazil. Noah Bullock, the executive director of Cristo Sal in El Salvador, and David Smildy, WOLA Senior Fellow, and Charles A. and Leo M. Favrat, Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University. What we're going to do is we're going to basically have a series of questions. So we invite everyone who's participating to please tweet with the hashtag WOLA taking stock if you want to have a question considered in this discussion. We will be starting basically with a general introductory question, asking this panelist to please tell us if you can describe the moment in the country and the region regarding authoritarianism and the impact it's having in human rights and democracy. And why don't we go ahead and start with Camila?
Okay, thank you, Jimena. So good morning to all that's following us in this webinar. Thank you, WOLA, for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about the situation in Brazil. Well, the moment in Brazil is one of the worst. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for your question, Jimena. And the moment in Brazil, I'm sad to say that's one of the worst moments in our quite young democratic history. So under the Bolsonaro administration, he took office in January 2019. So it's a year and a half of administration. And now, today, I'm okay to say that Brazil is under a democratic crisis. This is because Bolsonaro administration is attacking democratic institutions. So it's a climate of a war against the Congress and the Supreme Court in Brazil, and several attacks coming from the president himself and high-ranked representatives of his administrations. Also a very brutal attack against the press in Brazil, against human rights defenders. And even we had the president and some ministers calling NGOs terrorist groups. So this is how we have been treated by this administration. And also a number of setbacks in legislation, policies, and monitoring mechanisms in environmental and indigenous rights, and what we call a so-called public security, but in fact is a project from led by Bolsonaro administration to strengthen the police lethality in Brazil. So I think for now, this is a kind of this sad picture of democracy and human rights in Brazil.
Great. Noah, how are things in the region that you are in?
Well, I think, in history, authoritarianism feeds off of emergencies and extraordinary moments. That's part of the narrative that permits it to emerge. And the pandemic around the globe has been a petri dish to cultivate different types of authoritarian governments, and provided a context or a pretext in which governments in the region of the Northern Triangle of Central America have exercised extraordinary powers, pursued militarism, even in a public health response, and been able to restrict rights, at times legitimately for public health purposes, and at other times to move against opposition and concentrate power. In Guatemala, it's been notable that even in the context of the pandemic, the government or powers within the state have moved against prosecutors and judges who were key in combating corruption. Just this week, the president declared states of siege in two Guatemalan states in the northeast of the country, Zavala and Petén. And in Honduras, the regimens of emergency powers have been exercised illegally by the president. None of them have been sanctioned by the legislature. And the history of Juan Orlando having already largely consolidated power, even in the judiciary, those exercises of powers have led to abuses in which civil society feels like there aren't any recourses. They can't go to the courts. The judges are already stacked with people loyal to the president. And in that context, we've seen in Honduras just this week the disappearance of leaders of community organizations on the Caribbean coast, Garifuni people, and the killings of two trans women and a disappearance of another one. So there's direct consequences in vulnerable populations. And in El Salvador, it's been a remarkable moment, and I guess to use a word, to describe how quickly the president has moved to forward an agenda of concentrating power and undermining opposition. In that context, over 13,000 people have been detained by the Salvadoran government, either at the border or on the streets, under the context of the quarantines. Crystal Sal, our organization, has documented abuses perpetrated by the security forces, both the army and the police, who have been responsible for implementing the public health response, as much as the medical authorities in the country. And we've documented cases of torture, extrajudicial killings. The president has been vocal on his attacks against journalists, doctors, public health experts, human rights organizations. And I was beginning to make a list of this, and it occurs to me that I'm not sure what Salvadoran has not come under attack by President Bukele at some point during the quarantine. But the point being is that he's tried to position himself as a unique leader, positioned to save lives. And in order to do that, he needs to restrict rights. And he's positioned the Constitution, checks and balances, the separation of powers, human rights, journalism as obstacles for him to be able to save lives in El Salvador. So that's what it looks like here in South America.
Very concerning. David, are things any better in the regions that you cover?
Of course not. It's Venezuela, of course, has had a very public, really almost obscene, disastrous decline in the past couple of years, and that's only gotten worse this year. The current situation, the current context is one in which, we have an abusive, unpopular government that nevertheless holds power and is now organizing legislative elections for December, which, is constitutionally mandated. However, they have themselves handpicked the electoral authority, which of course is not going to generate the confidence you would need in the population or the opposition movement to actually go to elections. And they've also sort of expropriated through legal maneuvers the main opposition parties. And so you have a context in which you have unpopular government holding on to power by organizing unfair elections and having themselves sort of pushed into exile some of the main politicians and taking over the main party vehicles for this opposition. And so it's a very grim situation right now. Of course, to do this, they're they're engaging in quite significant repression. So far, in the first 5 months of this year, there have been 1,300 people killed by the police forces, and part of this is political, but mainly this is sort of a spectacle that the government creates to try and show that it's fighting crime, using what's called the Special Action Forces, the FIs, which is their latest iteration of militarized policing that comes into neighborhoods, shoots them up, and then says, well, 17 delinquents were killed in this operation. Venezuela is now a safer place. Of course, we have no idea how whether these people were delinquents and why they received the death sentence. But now oftentimes this FIS is also used at public protests and is used to intimidate any sort of uprising or efforts to protest the government. Of course, COVID has complicated all of this. In fact, back in February, when I was in Venezuela, there was some degree of hope that there could be an electoral agreement that would allow for legislative elections that actually generated some confidence in the population. But when COVID came, that allowed the government basically to sort of clamp down on society, and all this got put off. And in the end, the government felt very much strengthened because of COVID, and also because of some opposition missteps, and just pushed forward and took control of these elections. COVID also has generated a real wave of repression against journalists. Anybody that sort of does investigative journalism tries to sort of push beyond the official government numbers and suggest that they're not telling the full story, that there's something else going on, can get harassed and can get detained, and there's been really quite significant repression against journalism. Finally, the most recent sort of issue is that Venezuelans, of course, there's this migratory process throughout the region, and now in countries, especially Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, oftentimes the Venezuelans who are living very much, on the margins now have no way to engage in informal economy, are getting evicted from their homes, and they set back to their government. They set back to their own country, marching back to Venezuela. And the Maduro government has tried to control them at the border, put them in quarantine. Of course, it's a very porous border, and has this discourse now calling them bioterrorists, and suggesting that they are the source of the growing COVID problem in Venezuela, which is extremely unfair to stigmatize them that way. And of course, COVID now is picking up in Venezuela. They were sort of early adopters of masks, had a very aggressive policy at the beginning, but the logic of Venezuelan society in a time of crisis is such that it's very difficult for people to stay home. And what began as the COVID, of course, began in sort of the upper middle classes, people that traveled a lot, now is really picking up in barrios, and it's really difficult to know how they're going to stop it. The public health institutions are completely inadequate for the task.
Yeah, so when Jeff started earlier, he alluded to some of the challenges we are facing here in the United States and some autocratic tendencies that we see here. How are the actions of the Trump administration, either by omission or by direct action, influencing these situations in your countries? Let's start again with Camila.
Wow, this combination of actions and omissions is resulting in serious impact in Brazil. Just to mention that Bolsonaro, since he took office, he visited the U.S. 4 times already. So this is just an example of how Bolsonaro is giving priority to the U.S.-Brazil relations. I would say that the main impact is this idea of, backing up what Bolsonaro is doing here. And I was thinking about the best word to say it. I was thinking about, maybe it's a symbolic way of backing up to show that, Bolsonaro is how he is, and he's not alone. Or even worse, he is similar to the leader of a superpower in the world. So all the time he's referencing, so he or Bolsonaro even organize Facebook Lives. And sometimes he's organizing Facebook Lives showing that he's watching a press conference of President Trump, or that he did another live, a Facebook Live celebrating the 4th of July. So this kind of example shows that he's really using, and I'm okay to say that he's using Trump as a symbolic backup for his style. And this style, like between commas, is this rude attitude in person and in social medias. So a very aggressive language used in public events, in public hearings, in the social media as well. And also this style of a leader alleging all the time to be a victim of fake news. All the time, Bolsonaro is using these allegations and also using this divisive speech of us versus them. And the idea that if you have a critical voice on the Bolsonaro administrations, you are a communist. And this idea of us versus them and this divisive speech is very present. And of course, it's being backed in this style, and all the time. It's not just a coincidence, because Bolsonaro is making reference to the Trump style of presidency all the time, and also praising the style of Trump presidency and the way President Trump governs the country and deals with the press all the time. It's in Bolsonaro public statements. Also, this combination of actions and omissions, Jimena, has an impact in human rights situation in Brazil, which is really where is impacting the lives of the people, especially the vulnerable groups here. So attacking journalists, especially women journalists, is something that we are kind of coping. The resistance to recognize the racism in the actions of the police forces. Again, so all that we saw in the U.S. and the way President Trump reacted to the demonstrations after George Floyd's killing, well, we had similar reactions here from Bolsonaro, and not recognizing that there is a structural racism in the way the security force acts in both countries. Also, Bolsonaro, since he took office, he's dismantling armed control norms. And of course, there's a huge influence of the U.S. policy on this. And because it's impossible to not talk about pandemic, is this similar way of denying the gravity of the pandemic. So Bolsonaro was, since the beginning, opposing the shutting down businesses and the stay-home policies. Bolsonaro is a big fan and promoter of chloroquine. Even the military, the army distributed chloroquine to indigenous groups in the Yanomami indigenous land. We don't have a Minister of Health so far. For 2 months, it's a general who is sitting in this position in a temporary way, but it's almost 2 months that we have a general as the temporary Minister of Health. And the result of this, just to conclude this, is that, well, now, today, Brazil is the fastest rising COVID country. So we are the new epicenter, and we have 80,000 deaths caused from COVID-19 already, and the number is growing and growing. So we're still in this rising moment. And we are so in a bad position that Trump decided to suspend anyone coming from Brazil to be allowed to enter the U.S. soil. So this is how I think I can tell that it's a bit of a picture of these impacts.
Noah?
I think that a lot of what Camila says can be echoed again in effect in Central America, the normalization of autocracy, through the presentation of a direct personal relationship between President Bukele and President Trump that have lended legitimacy to the president. And then I think that the support from the U.S. is one of the pillars that sustains the Bukele administration. From a policy standpoint, the Trump sort of, the more direct action part of the question, the Trump administration has had kind of what I would call a migration myopics strategy, right? Similar to when the United States was engaged with Central America during the Cold War. We saw the region through one geopolitical lens, which was communism. Now the Trump administration sees the region through his objectives in terms of at least demonstrating a hard-fisted approach to migration. And so countries and strong arming the countries in the region to cooperate with him, at least symbolically, so that he can say that he is being hard on immigration to his base. And so in the case of El Salvador, President Bukele has signed, the ACA agreements, the refugee agreements, and that's sort of lended political support to Bukele. The ambassador here has played a role in also cultivating this sense of a unique and special historic relationship. He's used almost those exact words. He posts pictures in Twitter of him at the birthday party of the president. And that I think has definitely lent to, again, the legitimacy, the normalization of President Bukele. I should be fair, though, that the United States has also tried to play a complex role in supporting President Bukele, but also trying to call, the president into dialogue with the other branches of government to try and avoid a deepening of the crisis. And in that context, the ambassador has notably backed off of his very, very warm social media relationship a little bit with the president. But all that is to say that there are consequences, and those consequences are seen in those setbacks, those setbacks in previous U.S. foreign policy objectives towards the region. The agenda of combating corruption, strengthening the rule of law, and democratic institutions have all been put on the back burner, if not taken off the table, giving priority and preference to the migration objective. And some of the most visible results of that are in Guatemala. Obviously, when the U.S. sort of pulled support, the SIG fell through, the International Commission to Combat Corruption and Impunity. And in El Salvador, the president promised a CICIS, an international commission, but that commission that was set up is one that is not independent. It was done through the OEA, the Organization of American States, and has been not an effective counterweight to corruption, which there are now widespread cases and indicators that corruption is rampant, especially in the use of emergency funds. So as a consequence of this migration myopics, we see setbacks in previous foreign policy objectives in the region towards forwarding democracy, democratic institutions, rule of law, and countering corruption. And those, how long it will take to rebuild that, if we have a change of political power in Washington, is unknown. Will we be in a moment where the Central American governments, or in this case Bukele, has moved so quickly and advanced so far in terms of concentrating power that he's even insulated from public opinion, seeing a similar circumstance like in Venezuela. So it's not that it's not urgent to begin to try and generate some counterweights to these trends, because the consequences could be felt for decades.
Wow, that's why it's so important we're having these type of discussions to understand how this is playing out throughout the entire region. So David, what can you tell us about the Trump's actions or inactions?
Thank you, Jimena. First, just a clarification to echo what Jeff started with, and that is the idea that one of the sort of center foundational points of our approach to Venezuela is the idea that Venezuela is not just an appendage of the United States, that it has its own autonomy, its own dynamics. And in fact, that's one of our main sort of differences with some of our colleagues in Washington, is that is that we really sort of take umbrage at that portrayal of Venezuela, and that's because of the amount of time we spend in country and how tightly we work with our partners on the ground in Venezuela. That, of course, and we've worked on this for a long time before Trump, and so we know that there are dynamics going on. And in fact, in this case, I think if you look at Nicolas Maduro, this was clearly an authoritarian trajectory before Trump. I think actually the real turning point happened a couple of weeks before Trump was elected in October 2016, when Maduro, the Maduro government, canceled the push for a recall referendum. I think that was the moment in which a troubled democracy became a dictatorship, because it was the first time they really canceled electoral results. And so that pre-existed Trump, that tendency pre-existed Trump. Nevertheless, we can talk about what Trump has done, what the Trump administration has done, and how it has impacted authoritarianism in Venezuela. And I think here there's 4 points that I would emphasize. The Trump administration, since August 2017, has talked about a military option with Venezuela, that it has a military option. It still has not renounced that, even though it's clear that they're not planning on it. But since 2017, August, is mentioned a military option that has really had a very negative impact, in a sense that, first, it divides the opposition, it divides the Venezuelan opposition, because if you say that there's a military option, well, then there's a good part of the opposition that says, well, that is the way forward, that we have to do everything possible, for example, abstain from elections, abstain from politics of any kind, to try and draw that sort of military intervention, which could put an end to this misery. And given that the Venezuelan democracy is so distorted, well, it's a pretty compelling argument. No, and once you have that military option there, that's going to be an argument. You're going to have, on the one side, you're going to have people that recommend politics, mobilization, and elections. On the other hand, you're going to have people that recommend abstention, taking a step back from political life, and waiting or trying to generate military intervention. And that still besets. You can look at Twitter right now, and that is the fissure, and it's because of that. That military option also unifies the military. The Venezuelan military is very corrupt, but there is still, of course, sort of esprit de corps in the military. And, the idea of, if there's anything that can sort of pique a military person, it's the idea of foreign intervention. So if there's anything that can unify the military, it's that. Second is, I think, sort of a consistent underestimation of complexity. And I don't just mean cognitive here. I mean in terms of discourse. There's this constant discourse from the Trump administration that the Maduro government is about to fall, that it's weak, that it's just give it a little push and it's going to fall. And it's changed a little bit recently, but for a long time that was the discourse. And of course we know this discourse. This is the discourse, long-term discourse. You can see it in the Vietnam War. You can see it in Iraq. You can see it in Somalia, Libya. All these different interventions is always thought that this is going to be a cakewalk, especially among sort of neoconservatives. That tendency developed a sort of vicious circle with pre-existing opposition tendencies. There are strands of the Venezuelan opposition that have always underestimated the strength of Chavismo. They've always overestimated their own strength, and they've always overestimated how compelling their message is. And so this sort of, especially 2018, 2019, really combined with the Trump administration's neoconservative strands to sort of bring together, I think, a really sort of destructive path of the opposition and an unwillingness to really have a realistic assessment. The third thing is economic sanctions. Now, these started in August 2017 with financial sanctions, got a really significant boost in last year when basically the U.S. rolled out sanctions on Venezuelan oil, and then, even more importantly, secondary sanctions on Venezuelan oil, complicating their ability. This has really complicated the situation. Of course, the idea of this is that this is going to hit Maduro, the Maduro government, and behind this is a completely false analysis that suggests that they were basically just stealing all the oil money anyway, and so it doesn't affect the Venezuelan people. But of course, it has dramatically. Now, Venezuela, of course, has suffered a very extensive humanitarian emergency, an economic crisis. During all of this, the origins of that are ineptitude and corruption, but it's been very seriously complicated. And what that ends up doing is it hits the population more than it hits the Maduro government. It hurts the Maduro government, but it hurts the population more, and it reduces their ratio of power vis-a-vis the Maduro government. So it's really strengthened the Maduro government. Finally, I think we can talk about the United States sort of the past year has taken a very high-profile unilateral involvement in Venezuela. That has been sort of a boost to the opposition, but it's had, I think it's complicated the international field. No, I think it's made this unilateral sort of taking Venezuela up as a key issue, has made it more attractive for Russia, in particular. I think, of course, this too should not be overestimated. This predates Trump, but he's just made it more attractive. I think it's also made it less attractive for European countries. European countries have taken up this issue, but in the past 8 months, they've really sort of taken a step back. And I think part of it is because now the issue is so attached to the Trump administration that it just makes it politically difficult for them. So in all of this, just finally to end, it's important to think of politics as a relational field, And so the Trump administration is not just its impact on Maduro, but its impact on the opposition as well as the international context.
So given what you've both, you've all just mentioned, what would be a more constructive approach if you were able to come up with your own version of U.S. Foreign policy to the region in a way that it could counter these tendencies you've all mentioned? Let's start with Camila.
Okay. So a more constructive U.S. foreign policy, one, is stop being this bad influence, and simple like that. So just to give an example, Brazil, one of the first foreign policy acts of Bolsonaro administration was to leave the UN Global Compact on Migration. And this is just following the path of Trump and the U.S. leaving this global compact on migration. Also, all the time in the campaign, Bolsonaro was saying that he wanted to leave also the Paris Agreement. Of course, because of all the pressure, especially from foreign investors in Brazil, we still is part of the Paris Agreement, but this is a threat all the time there. It's all the time on the table of leaving the Paris Agreement. So please stop being this bad influence. The number two is stop asking Brazil to do the dirty work at the UN. And as you know, when Trump took office, he decided to leave the UN Human Rights Council. The US was a member of the council, and Trump decided to withdraw the US as a member. And Brazil is still a member. Brazil was actually re-elected last year. And we know that there's a lot of pressure from the US administration to have his good allies in the UN, both in Geneva and New York, to do the dirty work. And there was a very historical and important resolution adopted by the UN Human Rights Council now in July on racism and police brutality. In the beginning, the resolution that was presented by the African countries had the name US in the title of the resolution and also in the text of the resolution. But after a lot of negotiations and, part of the allies of the US working to remove the mention, the reference to the US in the title and the text of the resolution, in the end it was removed. But of course the name George Floyd is there. It shows 5 times in the resolution. I would also say that a more constructive US foreign policy um, to Latin America would involve a reconsideration of some initiatives of the U.S. State Departments, especially around freedom of religion. So this Commission on Unalienable, oh, this is a very tough word for me, rights. Also because, there was an article here in the Brazilian press showing that a representative from the Brazilian Family and Human Rights Ministry attended one of the meetings of this commission. And I know the commission is reaching a final point and presenting its report now. Also, the Secretary Pompeo was very vocal about it. So the reconsideration of this initiative would be interesting, including the International Religious Freedom Alliance. The Declaration of Principle was launched in February this year, 2020, and Brazil is a member along with the U.S., Hungary, and Poland. So, and we know this is also one of the priorities of the current U.S. Department of State. So the reconsideration of these initiatives would also take us to a more constructive U.S. foreign policy. And the international endorsement, and also reconsidering the international endorsement to what's happening in Brazil. Trump so far gave his green light to the Brazil claim to exceed the OECD. Also gave the green light to consider Brazil a non-NATO ally. So all these things are just, empowering and endorsing Bolsonaro internationally. And we have been also working with WOLA in some discussions around the U.S.-Brazil trade agreement and any advancement of this trade agreement without consideration of human rights aspects and environmental aspects would also, again, be backing and supporting the destructive policy of Bolsonaro in Brazil towards human rights and environmental rights. So a more constructive U.S. foreign policy to Brazil would be this one, the U.S.-Brazil trade agreement, to listen to local groups, to listen to the affected communities. Also, the Alcantara-based agreement, something that the agreement is already signed and ratified, so it got into force in December last year, but there's a huge threat to force displaced Quilombola communities living in Alcantara, so we need to change it. Also, there's a cooperation in place involving the Brazilian government and the U.S. government for mass deportation of Brazilians from the U.S. to Brazil. So this is also something that should be reconsidered in a more constructive U.S. foreign policy. And of course, Venezuela and everything that David was mentioning. The U.S. has a huge influence in Brazil's position towards Venezuela, and a less bellicose approach would be very positive. And also including the abandoning for good this option always mention of military intervention would be very important to if you want a more constructive U.S. foreign policy towards the region.
No, I'm going to add to this question, a question that we got from a reporter directed to you. So the reporter says, right now, the popularity of President Bukele gives him the confidence to act the way he is doing. How would it affect him and the rest of the countries with the same tendencies if in November elections, there's a change in the U.S. government? So if you don't mind adding that to your response, thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the core recognitions that Washington needs to make is that the conflicts in El Salvador right now are not about ideology. They're not even really about substantive policy debates. It is about the success or not of President Bukele's project to concentrate power and perpetuate himself in power. And so the U.S.'s actions need to be understood as either complicit in that project or as a check and balance to that project. And I think that what we need to have, and this is nothing revolutionary, this is nothing that hasn't been said before, but we need to have a policy that's built around a strong and consistent commitment to promoting democracy in the region. And the consistency is more important than the policy, because the U.S. has always said we're promoting democracy, and then we have done trade-offs to pursue our own narrow interests and manipulate governments, which is an undermining of democracy. So I think we need to be aware that in U.S. interventions, the most important action we can do towards promoting democracy in the region is encouraging governments to be responsive to the causes of the people. And what you see in Central America is a disconnect often between what electorates even desire and ask for and what the political class has been producing. Just to give you an example, in El Salvador, one of the most widely supported issues in El Salvador is the right to water. And it's an issue that not the legislature or the president has been clear on. That's a small example. In Guatemala, for example, 70% of the electorate supported secede and the work to combat corruption. But they didn't have the option to even elect a single candidate that was saying that they supported the continuation. So the United States needs to have that lens, and it has to be consistent and clear that supporting governments, encouraging governments to be increasingly responsive to their populations is the priority, and needs to be the trade-off to pursuing our narrow interests and trying to manipulate governments to cooperate on issues of trade, migration, to the detriment of the democracy. And that's on the basis that we say that democracy, or we believe truly that democracy will produce stability, security, and prosperity in that region that would benefit mutually the United States, Mexico, and the rest of the region. Concretely, I think we need to be an ally in the combat against impunity and corruption, supporting of democratic institutions, the separation of powers, the removal of the military from political life again, which was one of the major achievements of the police accords, and now the military is back and involved, especially in El Salvador. And I think that we should try and overcome our fear of an entanglement in another international commission against corruption in El Salvador. I think that there's some reticence because of the situation in Guatemala and how difficult that became. But El Salvador, in civil society organizations, we've reflected on what is the difference between an international commission against corruption and technical assistance to combat impunity. And the technical assistance is what we've always had. Financial support, technical support, sharing of information. But what's needed is a reform of institutions. And when in societies like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, the institutions have demonstrated a pattern in which they cannot reform themselves. And they cannot therefore make progress towards combating historic and structural impunity, there is a need for international cooperation. And right now in El Salvador, there's a need for international cooperation to combat impunity and corruption and restore rule of law. And the United States, I think, should own its potential to support that cause. We have a SECES in El Salvador that is a SECES in name only, an international commission in name only. And it actually, if it's permitted to continue that way, only is used to legitimize actions of this administration, which are contrary to the goals of combating impunity and corruption. So I mentioned that because it's an issue that I think can be concretely dealt with and needs support from Washington. Civil society organizations, including Crystal South, have presented a law to the Salvadoran legislature, which is being debated. They would establish a truly independent international commission. That law should be supported by the U.S., or that the goals of that law should be supported. And I think that the issue about the popularity and the political change in Washington is complicated. I mentioned in my last intervention that it could be too late. How quickly can President Bukele move to insulate himself from public opinion? We already see his popularity is in surveys and in the electoral result, and I still think that is a reaction of the population to the lack of alternatives. He is the alternative, and we have no alternative to this alternative. And so when we ask people if they continue to support this alternative, they continue to say yes. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a strong public political base of support for him, because his project is personalized. There's not a political or ideological or even a vision for the country that's necessarily brought forward. It's just that Nayib will save us. And I don't think that's sustainable. So if the political change in Washington happens in November, San Salvador Bukele will have to renegotiate his alliance with the United States. And I think that that's the opportunity for the United States to set very clear criteria for cooperation. If the United States sees itself as a power and in the world, that its interests are connected to having a rules-based international system, we need to make that clear to our allies. It's a multipolar world where China, Russia, India, Brazil all have different ways to exercise power, and the United States is the most powerful or most effective tool for right now in this moment is trying to restore an international system that's rules-based. And that means that we ally ourselves with people who are willing to cooperate with us on that agenda, including small partners like El Salvador that have a big impact in our region, closely, who are one of our most close neighbors. So I think that that's kind of what we would hope for, is that in November, the change of political power is a moment to change the terms of the agreements. And that change of the terms of the agreements would change the nature of this presidency. And that would be an important change.
Great, thanks. What about you, David?
Yes, good question. Let me just begin with the idea that, despite all our criticisms of the Trump administration's policy, we don't advocate a hands-off approach. That's never been our metaphor. For us, our central concern is the rights of Venezuelans. And that's something we see human rights as something that surpasses national sovereignty, and that's true no matter who the government is and who foreign governments are. We think, therefore, this stance, we think that left authoritarianism is something that we have to confront directly. We don't explain it away. We don't pull our punches, despite the fact that we're a progressive organization. So we think that foreign countries, the international community, should address authoritarianism in Venezuela, but of course they should do it intelligently. They should do it constructively. And so what we would like to see is basically the sort of the inverse of the four things that I mentioned that the administration has done wrong. We think that taking the military option off the table, I think, would change the game within the Venezuelan opposition and within the Maduro administration. It would, take a little bit of pressure off the military, which would force them to look around. It would also force the opposition to say, okay, either we just give up and leave Venezuela, or we're going to have to come up with a national political strategy to make our international strategy viable. Nobody's going to support us without having some kind of national strategy. And so very concretely, right now, what is happening in the Venezuelan opposition is sort of an attempt to think about what to do, given the unfair electoral context. What should they do? Should they try to declare administrative continuity and just say that, okay, well, there are no fair elections, therefore we're still the National Assembly and Juan Guaido is still the interim president in perpetuity, something that would probably lead them to have to leave the country and set up some sort of government in exile. The history of governments in exile are extremely grim, and that would not be a good direction. So they have to come up with another direction, and they have to come up with an idea, a realistic understanding of the situation. You have to set aside this sort of overconfidence, this idea that because we represent democracy, because Maduro is illegitimate, therefore we're going to win, and that the Maduro government is going to fall like the walls of Jericho when we blow our trumpets, and to come up with a realistic political strategy within the country and outside of the country. I think taking the military option off the table and changing the discourse, changing this overconfident discourse and going to a discourse that this is a complex political conflict, I think is what would really be fundamental. I think economic sanctions, as I mentioned before, are really sort of undermining the Venezuelan people. They're having an incredible humanitarian cost, which in itself is not worth paying. And of course, they strengthen Maduro. They strengthen Maduro by weakening society. They strengthen the state, they weaken society, they change the ratio of power, they diminish the ratio of power that the population has vis-a-vis their government. And so they're actually quite self-defeating. Of course, the response, many people recognize this, the response they get, oh, if you did that, it would be a victory for Maduro and just help him clamp down his authoritarian project, and that would be worse off for the Venezuelan people in the long run. There's some legitimacy to that argument, but of course, nobody's saying just unilaterally, lift sanctions. They could, or just lift them without any concessions. I think they could be negotiated. The Maduro government is very interested in these, and this could be a negotiation point to try and gain some real electoral conditions, perhaps gain a referendum, gain some changes that could really change the democratic playing field. And I think most importantly is the idea of working multilaterally. I think this is sort of a pipe dream within this administration. And I think the point of pride of the Trump administration is not working with other countries. But I think in a Biden administration, perhaps an effort to keep engaging and pressuring Venezuela, but doing it with other countries, and letting them lead, because the United States has a lot of baggage in Venezuela, has a lot of baggage in the region, but it also happens to have a lot of power. So I think it's an essential point here, and let other countries lead. Now, that said, let me just sort of contradict myself, because circumstances change so much. I mean, we have long said that the United States should not directly engage Maduro. That first of all, the United States should not be a protagonist in this, should not be a leader in this, and that also just sort of facilitates the Maduro's discourse that this is all about the United States and not about its population and its country. However, given that the United States has taken such a profile in the past year, well, perhaps it's time to rethink that. Perhaps the United States, could come into some sort of direct negotiation, given that the United States has so many logs in this fire now. And the United States, I think, could directly impact the United Nations. I mean, I think the United Nations is one actor, one player that has not actually taken this up. You talk to them, they know a ton, they know a lot, they have the right direction, the right ideas, but they don't engage. And UN watchers suggest that the only way the Secretary General would take that risk is if the United States really were behind it, and perhaps other actors in the Security Council. And so I think that those are the things that I think could protect the context of U.S. engagement in Venezuela.
Wonderful. So basically in today's discussion, we really just touched the surface on a whole host of issues that we could probably do seminars ad nauseum on. But I just want to reiterate a few of the general things that we heard today from our speakers. So we heard that basically the pandemic and the global public health crisis has been an opportunity for some of the leaders in the region to consolidate power, and that this is leading to human rights abuses, and the persons who are most affected are vulnerable populations, Afro-descendants, trans, journalists, human rights organizations, and that this may actually also be leading to a situation of more serious obstacles in terms of free elections. We heard that in terms of Trump, some of the leaders are copying his style, in particular his rhetoric and his us versus them divisive speech, and also relegating to the excuse of fake news whenever they are facing any allegations. It's been also a change in the region in terms of the personalization of relationships. And, that's been problematic. So has the way that the U.S. has looked at the migration issue in a very myopic way. And this its own geopolitical lens, and there are some serious setbacks in the region in terms of U.S. policy efforts that were actually positive in terms of anti-corruption and migration. We've heard that there is a lot of these tendencies towards authoritarianism really pre-existed Trump, but that definitely during this administration things have gotten worse. And that the discourse does have an influence. And basically, it would be important, regardless of who is in the presidential office, that we envision a more constructive approach for the United States. And here we heard that first, the US should stop being a bad influence. It should stop asking some of these leaders to do its dirty work in the international stage. That it should basically rethink some of the policies or programs that are underway through the State Department. There needs to be consistency in U.S. policies, and that basically the U.S. should play a role of encouraging governments to be accountable to their own people and responsible to them, to help reform institutions. And use its international cooperation in that matter. Also, that the U.S. needs to be an ally in a lot of these issues, especially when it comes to combating impunity and promoting real democracies. Another recommendation that was mentioned was to remove the military from the political life that has not had a very good history in the region. And lastly, it's important that the matters of authoritarianism are basically divorced from ideology, that they should be looked at as structural issues that need to be addressed. And that basically by working multilaterally, the United States could go back to having a more constructive role in the region. So that said, I know I didn't capture everything, but I think that it gives us some points and thoughts to think about. We will be gathering this information, figuring out what we're going to be doing with it with these seminars, maybe write a piece or something else. We're not sure right now, but I want to thank all of our panelists and thank Jeff for his remarks, and also invite you all to come back next week to listen to our next panelist in this series, which will be looking at corruption in the Americas. Thank you very much.